The revolution is here. A movement of people free to live, work, and choose. We won't tell you what to think. We just demand that you think for yourself. This is Kibbe on Liberty. Jay, good to finally see you.
Good to meet you, Matt.
Yeah.
Here.
It's at the timing of this conversation. I think is quite interesting because I guess the Great Barrington Declaration was signed in October of 2020. So we're sort of 3 months out to the 2-year anniversary. But the more interesting thing is that there's a brand new wave of mask mandates in LA County, I think in other sort of blue areas. And there's talk of new lockdowns, and it feels like Groundhog Day. Like, did we learn nothing over the last 2 years? But you're one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, and you've been outspoken about the unintended consequences, incredible humanitarian destruction that's been caused by this brand new paradigm of lockdownism. And I don't want to go through all this. I just watched your Lex Friedman conversation, which I thought was pretty interesting. But it might. I wonder how many of your views have changed a little bit because of where we are today. Is there no learning in public health?
It sure seems that way, Matt. I mean, I think it's astonishing to me to watch people push for more of the same 2.5 years after we've basically learned that not much of that worked.
Yeah.
And as you said, has caused tremendous damage to the poor, the vulnerable, working class people. I think if you look, for instance, I just saw a video from a teacher in San Diego. Basically, I guess a superintendent in San Diego saying public school kids, if they're going to come back, they have to come back masked, or else they're going to go out to Zoom school.
Yeah.
I mean, to threaten children to interrupt yet another year of their education is just, at this point, I don't even call it an unintended consequence anymore. I mean, I think it's a basic violation of their human rights.
Yeah, it seems like there's sort of systemic institutional failure going on here, both in public health, in education. Not inconsequentially, these are government-controlled institutions that perhaps are immune to accountability, I think.
You know, Matt, you asked me what's different about, so that Lex Friedman interview was about 6 months ago. What's different now is that we are a much more immunized population. We have much more immunity and protection against the disease than we did 6 months ago, than we did certainly 2.5 years ago. A very large fraction of people have had the disease and recovered, and that provides pretty strong protection against severe reinfection. It's not that you can't get infected again. It's just that if you get reinfected again, it's likely to be less severe than the first time, and that's just going to be, that's a fact. You can see it in the epidemiological literature as true. And as well, we've had immunized a very large fraction of the adult population. There really, at this point, is no policy that we have that would stop the disease from spreading, and we shouldn't pretend like there is. We have to learn to no longer fear the disease as we once did.
So I want to dig deeper into that, and I specifically want to sort of reset so that people understand who you are. And for those few people that don't know what the Great Barrington Declaration is, I want to reset the history so that people understand what you did, why you thought it was common sense, and why you became public enemy number one. But what are your qualifications? You're both an epidemiologist and a health economist.
Yeah, so I have an MD and a PhD in economics. I've been teaching at Stanford for 20-some years as a professor in medicine in the medical school there. I have been writing on infectious disease epidemiology for basically almost all of that time, although I write on other topics as well. In particular, in the early days of the pandemic, I worked on a couple of very high-profile studies measuring how widespread the disease was in April of 2020 using antibody tests. So antibodies are, as you know, if you get everyone knows now, you get disease, you then produce antibodies in response. It's a measure of whether you've been infected. In those early days, we found that a very large number of people, much more than expected, were already infected in Santa Clara County, California, and in LA County, California. Something like 4% of the population, 3% of the population in April of 2020 were already infected, 50 times more than the number of cases to date that have been found. That led me down this path of trying to understand how risky the disease was, what the risk profiles are. Older people are much more likely to be sick and die if they get the disease, whereas young people are relatively unscathed. And that then led in October 2020 to the Great Barrington Declaration, which is a document I wrote with Sunetra Gupta of Oxford University and Martin Kulldorff then of Harvard University, where we argued that given this risk profile and given the fact that lockdowns are so harmful to so many people, especially the poor, the vulnerable, the working class, it makes no sense to lock down a society. Instead, what we should do, the right thing to do, is focus protection of the old and the otherwise people who are susceptible to bad outcomes if they should get infected.
So obviously by that point, lockdowns were the new paradigm. Did you think that what you were saying would be so controversial?
I mean, by October 2020, I didn't have any illusions about the controversy around it. It was really clear, although there were some people at the time saying that lockdowns weren't going to come back. It was really clear that that politicians and public health were pushing for more lockdowns. We'd already had the March lockdowns in the United States and elsewhere that didn't stop the disease from spreading. In fact, it, as best I can tell, had very little appreciable effect at all in getting rid of the disease. It may have protected certain, like laptop class of people who could stay home and stay safe, but all the rest of society that served them got sick, or much of the rest of society got sick. So at that point, it was really clear to me that there was no point to the lockdown strategy. It wasn't going to, at best what it does is move infections off into the future, give some relatively well-off people the illusion that they can protect themselves while the rest of society suffers. It's just immoral. At the same time, it's epidemiologically, it doesn't make any sense when you know that there is a class of people, older people, people living in nursing homes, who do need protection, who could be protected if you just put your mind to it.
I feel like I've read this and from credible sources that the whole lockdown paradigm had been debated and debunked and rejected by the health community generally during previous pandemics. Is that true? And who flipped the switch that said, okay, we're going to try this new thing with such obvious costs associated with that? I'm an economist by training, and I knew in March of 2020 that you can't there's no switch to shut off the economy, and more importantly, there's no switch to turn it back on. This is not even economics; it's common sense. But somehow, where along the way, you got this almost scientific attitude that we're gonna sort of micromanage from the top down the entire globe when it comes to this pandemic. What happened?
Yeah, so if you go back to the Anthrax Attack in 2001, it set off this sort of chain reaction of trying to figure out how do we manage bioterrorist events, and then there were the Avian Flu, a series of threats that happened during in the early part of the 21st century. A lot of people in the epidemiologic community, infectious disease community, their instinct was, well, maybe we could stop this by putting some interventions in place, like very severe interventions that were like stay-at-home orders and things like that. There was a thorough debate, and there were these pandemic plans where they would calibrate based on the level of risk, these kinds of ideas. These were thoroughly debated, just exactly like you said, Matt. And for the most part, in practice, they weren't used. So, for instance, 2009, the H1N1 epidemic, we didn't use lockdowns. We could have. I mean, the early estimates of mortality that the World Health Organization promulgated then were something on the order of 3, 4, 5, much higher, very, very high percent death rate from infection. And yet we didn't do a lockdown. It's an unprecedented strategy that we actually ended up adopting. in March of 2020 in the United States and elsewhere. You asked why. I think the key reason actually has to do with the Chinese response and the Italian response. The world was watching the Chinese response. There was a sense that China had hidden the full extent of the epidemic. And then in January 2020, they locked down their entire, this enormous city of Wuhan and its environs. And then it looked like it worked. The World Health Organization's telling people, oh, look, they locked down, they stopped the disease, went away. In late January, you started seeing cases in the United States. You saw cases in Iran. And then, of course, in Italy, there was an enormous outbreak in Lombardy. And there were, like these pictures of people, of older people in coffins lined up in a cathedral because they didn't have enough, people to bury them. I mean, I think those kinds of images, in the minds of public health, alarmed them, and that flipped the switch. They turned away from the much more sensible approach, which is a focused protection approach, the same approach we've taken to a century of respiratory pandemics. And went back to the thing that they've been talking about since 2001. Maybe we can just lock down society. I think it was incredibly naive in terms of the ability to actually stop the disease from spreading, and then it was also incredibly naive in terms of the harms that it was going to do. You're absolutely right, Matt. You can't turn off society and expect to have no harm come from it.
Yeah, and it's not. I don't think it's probably a coincidence that the model comes, practically speaking, from China and the World Health Organization. I think there's an obvious strain of sort of authoritarian central planning that comes along, both the willingness to use that kind of power, but also the arrogance that you could know better than decentralized society how to deal with a threat like this. And like you touched on something that I've always wondered about. I have a theory that we now, I guess, are allowed to acknowledge that the NIH was doing gain-of-function research. Fauci denied it, but my understanding is that the NIH has now come out and said, yes, we were doing that. And it's obvious that they were, because Fauci himself was writing articles saying this is really important and the potential downside risk is worth the price. Does this all come out of sort of a big influx of research dollars after 9/11? And because it seems like, and this gets into sort of this scientific arrogance that I'm really worried about, it seems like there's a lot of people being paid a lot of money to imagine all these worst case scenarios, go out and harvest potential viruses from bat caves, maybe manipulate those viruses. We don't know exactly the extent of that, so that there can be a central plan for every possible situation. Is that where it came from? I mean, you're part of this community.
That's exactly where it came from. Although I'm not part of the virology community that was part of this, but I learned about this later, actually. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of that. Right. So in 2005, I think, was the avian flu and the scare, and there was a scare that that this virus that was infecting chickens would make the leap to humans and then cause all kinds of damage and harm to chickens, to humans, right? Left from chickens, I think. That led to a research agenda funded in part by the NIH and certainly by large scientific organizations around the world, with people like Dr. Fauci as proponents of a research agenda to see whether there were viruses out there in the world, bat caves and elsewhere, that have the potential to jump into humans. And the research agenda is very simple. What you do is you bring and simple and to describe it, it's complicated to implement. You bring the virus into a lab. You go hunt them elsewhere. You bring viruses that are out in the wild into the lab, and then you mutate them by running them through civets or whatever, and you check to see how many mutations are needed so that it can infect a human cell in a petri dish or whatever. If it doesn't take that many mutations, well, then this is a virus that might make the leap, would be the inference. And then you can also then start to make vaccines to address the threats, potential threats from viruses that are likely to make the leap, so that if it does spread, you can have a vaccine, some remedy in place. Exactly, science is the scientific kind of approach to future threats.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with Blaze TV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it.
The idea then was actually implemented in 2012. There was a paper published in a big scientific journal where they actually had successfully done this. They found out that a virus in the wild could make the leap with just a few mutations. This set off a firestorm within the virology community. What ended up happening was a big counter push by this group called the Cambridge Working Group that forced the virology community to do a pause on this gain-of-function work. The NIH also adopted this pause on the funding of this gain-of-function work. The counter-argument, and this is what the Cambridge Working Group made, was that, look, it's a really dangerous thing you're doing here. There's a long history of dangerous viruses leaking out of labs, not intentionally. It's just, when you're working in a lab, 365 days a year, it's very easy, even in a high-security lab, to slip up. And a slip-up means that the lab worker gets sick, they go home, and then they spread the virus out inadvertently to other people. That could happen, has happened with dangerous viruses repeatedly going back decades. And so there was a pause put where the idea was that let's evaluate the procedures that labs do. Let's adopt new procedures. Let's try to figure out ways to make this safer. Although I don't think it's possible to make it as safe. It's just not possible to make it safe.
Safe enough.
It's safe.
Yeah.
I think even one slip could destroy the world, right? So
Right.
why do it? But let's leave that aside. In 2014, then there was this pause of gain-of-function work put on by the NIH, meaning pause of funding. Every study that was doing this sort of gain-of-function work had to be personally approved by Tony Fauci and Francis Collins, because Tony Fauci is the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. They're the ones that are funding a lot of this virological work. So what happened was that they actually did continue to sign off on some of these, and including on projects that were cooperating with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where I think it's where this virus may have arisen. So I don't know for sure if it is, but that's the
We still don't know.
Yeah. In any case, the NIH then was funding this work into even during the pause, not the same pace as before. And then in 2017, when Trump came into power, the NIH that had put in place something called a PPP framework, potential pathogens something framework, where they would formalize the approval of these gain-of-function work. And so after 2017, in effect, Tony Fauci tricked Trump into this. Trump didn't know what he was doing here.
Yeah.
And then we continued to fund it. This is not controversial. It's just a fact. Although I think Fauci actually denied it in front of
Rand Paul.
Congress,
Yeah.
Rand Paul in Congress, right? So it's something that we should have had a much more public discussion around, because there is some potential for good from it. Like, you have a virus that you think might cause a pandemic. We'll have a vaccine available immediately. That's the potential of it, right? But on the other hand, if in doing that research you greatly increase the risk of the virus spreading, I think most people would just say no.
Yeah. So when I, particularly going back to the early days of the pandemic, when I don't understand what's going on, as an economist, I use two basic frames to try to better understand what might happen. And one is sort of Hayek's understanding of decentralized knowledge and how the local knowledge of time and place percolates up. And this is how we figure out complex problems in the face of radical uncertainty. And to replace that process with a really smart guy at NIH that's going to sort of decide for us. To me, it sets off alarms before I even know what's going on. And the other piece is sort of a public choice Jim Buchanan kind of piece where even if you trusted that the people in charge knew the proper path to move forward, which is very difficult, if not impossible to find, you wouldn't trust them with that much power. And so I look at this whole debacle and this idea that we're harvesting and manipulating viruses as a classic case of fatal conceit, as Hayek would use the phrase, because they didn't know enough, and even if they did know enough, they would have these sort of perverse bureaucratic incentives to do things that weren't necessarily in the public health. And I think those two frames now, 2 years later, look pretty damn smart. But the question I have is the reaction of Fauci and Collins, and I definitely want to get into the infamous emails. When you guys released the Great Barrington Declaration, we now know that there was an orchestrated campaign to smear you guys, and it seems like was it, were they covering something up, or were they just so conceited that they knew that they had the plan? But retell the story about what these very important guys said about you fringe epidemiologists.
Sure. So I gotta say, like I now have business card that says fringe epidemiologist on it. Let me tell the story. Actually,
you might as well own it.
Yeah. So I'm kind of proud of the term now. When we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, this is in October of 2020. 4 days after we wrote it, the head of the NIH, Francis Collins, National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, wrote an email to Tony Fauci, calling the three primary authors, me, Sunetra Gupta, and Martin Kulldorff. He called it the three of us fringe epidemiologists. I mean, it's well, whatever. I'll just leave that aside, right?
Stanford, Harvard, Oxford,
yes, right?
Fringe institutions. Sure.
Well, the thing is that's why he wrote that email. Right, he wrote that, and then he called for a devastating published takedown of the premises of the Declaration. He wrote that email because the institutions from which we wrote, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, threatened him and his lockdown strategy. Mm-hmm. It threatened his underling Tony Fauci's strategy. Right, it was when we wrote the Declaration. Almost hundreds of thousands of regular people signed on to it. People sent in from around the world. They sent us translations of the document. It's a page document. You can go look it online, see if you find it controversial. They sent us translations into 30 different languages. Almost immediately, we got tens of thousands of scientists and epidemiologists signing on. What the Great Barrington Declaration did, the reason why it was important is not actually the ideas in it. The ideas in it are as old as the hills. Yeah. The reason it was important is because it told the world that there was not actually a scientific consensus in favor of lockdown and the lockdown strategy we adopted. And that's why Tony Fauci and Francis Collins acted the way they did. That was the threat. It undermined the illusion that there was a consensus around this lockdown, and they couldn't abide that. This goes back to your point about Hayek and decentral. I mean, I'm just like trying to imagine what Hayek would have made of the interchange between Rand Paul and Tony Fauci in the Senate, where very famously Tony Fauci's response to Rand Paul was like, if you're criticizing me, you're not simply criticizing a man, you are criticizing science itself, right, or something very close to that. I mean, in a sense, it's like this like, la science c'est moi, like the Louis XIV kind of moment for a science bureaucrat. Right. The arrogance is almost unbelievable. And the Great Barrington Declaration, what it did is it punctured that arrogance, because it said, look, there are a lot of prominent, well-known, completely reasonable, not actually fringe scientists who don't like the strategy you've adopted, who think that the strategy you've adopted was an enormous mistake. And that's why you saw this smearing campaign. And they're very effective at that. Like they have, I started getting calls from reporters asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip. Yeah. I never said those words. I never even thought those words. It's not in the Great Barrington Declaration. It's a piece of propaganda. designed to destroy the credibility of anyone who says it, because my primary goal is to save life, right? Protect vulnerable populations. The key tenet of the plan of the Great Barrington Declaration is focused protection of the old. How is that letting the virus rip? I mean, and then there's this sort of demonization of the idea of herd immunity, as if it's some sort of weird conspiracy theory or strategy, when in fact it's just a biological fact. Right. This pandemic ends when there's sufficient immunity in the population. It's not now. What we know is that kind of immunity doesn't protect you from getting the disease over again. What it does, it'll be more like the other coronaviruses, where you can get them over again, but you don't get severely ill. Right. So I think that idea that herd immunity is a strategy, they use that as a propaganda tool against, in favor of lockdown, as if somehow the endpoint of lockdown strategy isn't also herd immunity.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you're quoting Louis XIV, because in Hayek's critique of this mindset, the counter-revolution of science, he has this devastating and uncharacteristically sort of snide takedown of a French philosopher aristocrat named Henri de Saint-Simon. And Saint-Simon and he's considered the sort of the founding father of socialism, even though one of his students coined the word. But he had this idea that you would create something called the Council of Newton after Sir Isaac Newton, and he would actually create temples to Sir Isaac Newton, and they were going to find engineers and scientists and put them on this council and basically give them the power to reorganize society from the top down. And I remembered that, watching this almost religiosity of I am the science, Anthony Fauci, and you can buy prayer candles to Anthony Fauci on Amazon, and it just got really weird. I'm like, but I think it was ultimately like a propaganda campaign. If you can't question that faith in the science, otherwise you're a monster. You want to let it rip. You don't care about people. And one of the first things you dealt with was this ridiculous argument that you can either focus on public health, or you can worry about the economy and dollars, and that would be an awful thing, because that's obviously these things are intimately intertwined. You're a public health economist. What are the consequences of shutting down the economy just in terms of public health?
I mean, that dichotomy between lives versus dollars was always a lie from the very, very beginning. The question was on both sides of the lockdown equation was lives, right? In principle, before the idea was that lockdowns would save lives, prevent people from getting COVID. Although now we know that they didn't do all that well at that. And as economists, I would have expected economists to speak up and say, well, look, that's too simple. Yeah, you may save some COVID lives. We as economists maybe don't know exactly how many. But on the other side, we know for certain that if you lock down a society, try to shut down its economy, suppress the freedom of billions of people to go about their lives, you will kill people. People will die as a consequence of it. It was always lives versus lives. It was never dollars versus lives. And yet that simplistic comparison between lives and dollars, it silenced so many economists from speaking up with what we normally would do, which is say, look, there's some cost to this strategy that you're proposing. Yeah. Just to give some sense of the practicality of it, like what it actually meant. Right. So in rich countries, what it meant is that people stayed home with heart attacks and died from heart attacks rather than go into get the ER because they were so afraid of COVID, or that they were told that they wanted to keep hospitals empty, that they just died at home. People skipped cancer screening. So women will have late-stage breast cancer and die of late-stage breast cancer that should have been picked up earlier as a consequence of the lockdowns. We destroyed the schooling of millions and millions of poor children, especially those in public schools, for basically nothing, right? 2+ years of educational disruption that they're never going to get back. And we know from the health economics literature that if you interrupt schooling for even short periods of time, you basically consign kids to a life that is poorer, that is less healthy and shorter. One estimate suggested 5.5 million life years lost in American kids just from the spring 2020 lockdowns alone. That's in rich countries. I could go on. There's more we could talk. The psychological harms we haven't even touched on.
If you've made it this far into the show, it means I must be doing something right. Kibbe on Liberty is just one of the amazing products we create at Free the People. We tell emotionally compelling stories and produce educational videos for the liberty curious. Our award-winning documentaries personalize all things liberty, independence, creativity, hard work, integrity, and perseverance. After the show, check out our work at freethepeople.org. And if you like what you see, donate to support what we do. That's freethepeople.org. Now back to the show. Yeah.
In poor countries, now the world is interconnected, right? So the last 30, 40 years, one of the major sort of good things that come out is that we've interconnected the world, as a result, 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty worldwide. How did that happen? In part, it happened because poor countries reorganized their economies in order to fit into this globalized, sort of the broader global economy. Overnight, we just said, no, thank you. The consequences of that have been tremendously bad, right? So the UN estimated very, very early on that 100 million people would be thrown into poverty as a consequence of this. That is actually come to pass. 100 million people have been thrown into poverty. We're talking dire $2 a day of income or less poverty. Tens of millions of people have been thrown into dire food insecurity, meaning they go to bed hungry. In March of 2021, there was an estimate that UN put out that 230,000 children had died in South Asia alone as a consequence of the lockdown, the economic dislocation caused by the lockdown, in particular through hunger and skipped vaccinations. Right, that is the cost of the lockdown. You can denominate it in dollars if you want, but don't make any mistake. It was not dollars that was at stake. It was lives of the poor and the vulnerable that was at stake when we decided to lock down, and they are the ones that have paid the price for it.
You know, one of the things that you discussed with Lex Freeman, and I'd love to dig a little bit deeper. I mean, you mentioned a laptop class, but they're very much lockdowns. Very much created a paradigm that almost sounds Marxist, where there are haves and have-nots, and there were essential employees and there were non-essential employees, and it's just morally and economically, the idea that we could choose who is essential and not in an infinitely complex supply chain structure that affects people in India that we don't know. Maybe we don't even know India exists, but all these countries, it's all intertwined. But the thing that's so infuriating 2 years in is the laptop class. I'll generalize, but they seem to be the strongest advocates for continuing lockdowns, certainly in the first year and a half, because they had the sort of jobs. First of all, they're high-income people. They had the sort of jobs that allowed them to work from home, but they still expected, without even understanding what it was, the supply chain to work. Which means they expected the farmers and the truckers and the pickers and the packers and that entire distribution network, all the way up to that poor guy that's doing Uber Eats, bringing food to their door. They had to work. Why don't I guess people just don't understand that food doesn't magically show up at your front door. Maybe it's not evil. Maybe it's just ignorance. I don't know.
I mean, food, electricity, keeping your house up,
everything.
Everything. Right? Like our society depends on billions of people we don't know working together to essentially to sustain us, and that's true for everybody, right? Even the billions that are doing the sustaining. I think the difference between now and let's say 2009, during the H1N1 epidemic, why we didn't do a lockdown, is because we now have the technology to replace the jobs of about 20 or 30% of workers in the United States with work from home, without any threat to their job, we didn't we had Skype in 2009, but not sufficiently evolved so that it could actually replace work. In a real sense, the lockdowns arrived because of Zoom.
Yeah.
We didn't have Zoom, there's no lockdowns, I think.
My team's going to be happy to hear that Zoom is the devil in this, because we did too much of that during lockdowns.
I mean, it's like I don't blame people. It's just we have this new technology. How do we use it? But what ended up happening is that there's something to the Marxist critique. There is a class structure of society. There's absolutely true, and it becomes clear that there is a class structure, and the class structure of society is such that. That this I've been calling it the laptop class because just to distinguish from people who could work from home from who couldn't, right? The vast majority of the world population couldn't, but this class could. But this class had an enormous influence on and representation in the press and in the political sphere, and they really drive policy. You can see that during the pandemic, and they were scared of the virus. And they had the power to protect themselves from the virus through their influence on policy, and they did that.
Yeah. By the way, the two industries that were the primary advocates of lockdowns, the media, they can all work from home. They did work from home. And broadly speaking, the bureaucratic class. And another thing that just infuriated me is I think to a person, the advocates of lockdowns were the last people in line to worry about, am I going to get paid? Will I have a job? And that's particularly true in government. The money was flowing, and they never considered the idea that they would be impacted. So there's kind of a, they're living in their world and perhaps not appreciating the ripple effects for people that were told they couldn't work, and without work they wouldn't have income, and without income they wouldn't have food. And more severe, obviously, in other countries than in ours. I want to go back to and I want to pick on this bureaucratic class for a while because I think there's there's a dangerous perversion in our institutions resulting from that, the fact that they're fully financed and unfireable. And going back to the Fauci-Collins exchange, where you guys were fringe epidemiologists, and they launched this very effective propaganda campaign. There are incentives to do that, and you and Lex Friedman talked about the respect that you have for Francis Collins, and you're welcome to weigh in on that. And I don't know what you think about Collins and Fauci today, because you have been an NIH grant recipient. Where are you at today on this before I go too wacky on you?
I mean, I still respect Collins. I think the work that he's done as a scientist in his career was worthy of respect. He was the head of the Human Genome Project, a colossal undertaking that greatly advanced our knowledge about the biological sciences. And I also respect very much his strong stance that faith is not incompatible with a life in science. I think he's lived that through his career, and I'm quite in awe of that, and it just makes me sad still. I mean, I don't think I'm anywhere different. I think we're human. They're human. I think the central problem they had was hubris, which is a characteristically human flaw, especially with someone high in power. You mentioned Buchanan earlier. Right? I mean, that's a classic Buchanan trope, right? Is of someone high in bureaucratic power, thinking that they're smarter than everyone else in a sense, right? And that's it's almost Shakespearean in its downfall, right? So I think I regret that it was them that ended up doing these. These were people that I have long respected, and I'm really sad that they ended up being the people that were subject that were like vulnerable to this trap that they found themselves in. They thought they knew better how to manage the world than everyone else.
Yeah, I think it's hubris and concentration of power were the sort of 1-2 punch that unleashed this disaster. There is, however, this inherent problem. You talk about the scientific process, and I think it's interesting because those of us that understand the iterative process of science, and again going back to Hayek, the trying to figure out how the world actually works, you would be almost clownishly arrogant to say, I am the science, given that a real scientist understands how little we actually understand about how the physical world operates. And so it's a combination of humility. You have to know what you don't know, but I suspect a good scientist is also a little bit arrogant, right? You have the hubris to say, I think I can figure out this insanely complex thing. But when you centralize all that, there's no check on the hubris.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's going on. And I think this mad science experiment that you're going to catalog every potential risk, viral risk to humanity, and then come up with a central plan to respond to it. That to me sounds like kind of a Frankenstein nightmare.
It's almost like a science fiction novel come to life.
Yeah.
I think actually I love how you characterize it. You do have to have some sense that you see the world a little bit more acutely than everyone else if you're going to be a scientist. But it has to come with that check.
Yeah.
The check comes in the form of you have to run an experiment or check what the data actually show. And every scientist that's honest will have had ideas that then they look at the data and turn out to be wrong. That's what science is. I mean, that's the experience of science for every scientist, every honest scientist, is that experience of looking at the data, turns out you're wrong. And what do? You change, you alter your hypothesis, you learn, you interact with other scientists, and over time, what happens is you the truth starts to come out slowly and painfully.
Yeah.
Right. I think that process is actually the fun of science. Right. That sense of like I'm at the I think Newton said it is he's sitting at the shore of a great ocean picking shells off, and trying to understand. I mean, that just there's a sense of like there's way more out there than we know. But it's a great kind of discovery. To replace that with I am the science is a perversion of science itself, I think.
Yeah, and by the way, it's maybe you I've heard you talk about the things that you got wrong. I actually think that's unusual for scientists to say that because they are a little bit full of themselves. But the check is your colleagues. The check is the push and pull and critique that comes from your colleagues, and maybe it's good-natured, but maybe it's like full-on academic competition where I want Harvard to be the center of the universe, and you want Stanford to be the center of the universe. It's a form of market competition where if you get it wrong, that somebody just as smart as you might call you out, and that would be tremendously embarrassing and damaging to your career.
I think that's partly why I was so disappointed with Francis Collins and with Fauci. Right? In order for science to work, that it has to be basically very freewheeling. Right? You can't a priori exclude from the conversation ideas or people simply because you think they're wrong.
Yeah.
Right? You have to allow the fact that even if they look ridiculous to you now, that they might be right, and then allow them to be part of the conversation in good faith. Instead, what they did is they engaged in a campaign to delegitimize a vast number of scientists who disagreed with them. That is a violation of the norms of science. In fact, it's not science anymore when they're doing that.
Yeah. So we haven't said this yet, but practically speaking, these two guys very much controlled, certainly the government allocation of research dollars, and that's a huge number. But I suspect, the imprimatur of the NIH and I can never say Fauci's acronym correctly, but that imprimatur very much drives private research dollars as well. So they essentially have a monopoly on which projects get funded and which don't. That in and of itself seems dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are private funders, but the NIH plays an outsized role in the careers of biomedical scientists. Fauci's NIAID in particular makes careers of people in virology, in immunology, in epidemiology, or breaks them, right? So at Stanford, where I teach, for the longest time, in order to get tenure, in order to get promoted, so that you could continue your scientific career there, you needed to have a large NIH grant. So it's not simply the money; it's the status that comes with that money from the NIH grant. That's what they control. And it's not just, there's Fauci and Collins and the NIH. There are other funding agencies. You'd think that they would be competing in a different way. In fact, they actually move together with the NIH. It's just as the way you say, Matt. I mean, it's not a healthy environment. Like what you really need is some kind of decentralized competition within science, so that scientists can, in good faith, talk with each other and disagree with each other and learn from each other, not align with the head boss to say, okay, well, if he's in favor of lockdowns, I need to not say anything about my reservations about lockdowns.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love liberty and look cool. And that, of course, is what happened, is that the incentives were such that, which doesn't explain the three signers of the Great Barrington Declaration, by the way, but the incentives were such that if you question the man who says, I am the science, you're going to get shut off. Your career is going to get damaged, maybe destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of scientists who signed the Great Barrington Declaration told me that they've been harmed. Their career had been harmed, right? Some of them lost their jobs, actually, for the act of signing it, so in effect. Some of them lost opportunities for grants. Their colleagues have shunned them. It's an odd thing. Like, they sign a document that says, let's follow the old-fashioned pandemic plan, and somehow you get pushed out of the scientific community.
Ostracized.
That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It is such an odd thing. Like, you would normally would expect scientists to embrace this kind of disagreement.
Do you think has this centralization of money and power, is it different today than it was 20 years, 40 years, 60 years ago?
I think so. I before the pandemic, I had been working on science policy and trying to understand a puzzle, which is why we've been spending a lot more money on science than we previously had been, and yet by most measures of scientific productivity, the number of advances per dollar had shrunk. It's not that there weren't scientific advances; it just seemed like we're spending a lot more per scientific advance. And some people have described this, like Peter Thiel described this, as scientific stagnation.
Yeah.
So the part of the reason for that is, ironically, is Francis Collins.
That's really interesting to me because I worked on Capitol Hill between 92 and 96, and this is the Republican Revolution. Newt Gingrich takes over in 1995, and for all of the, I think, heroic efforts to balance the budget and rein in the rate of growth of spending, his Achilles heel was science. And he was, I'm pretty sure he was the guy that was celebrating the Human Genome Project. And they poured a lot of money into science, which might have fueled, perhaps unintentionally, the centralization.
Yeah, there was a doubling of the NIH budget, right? I think in 98, the Balanced Budget Act of 96 had within it a doubling of the NIH budget. I don't remember exactly which legislation did this, but I do know that by 1998, when I started my scientific career, the NIH was flush with cash. And it was actually a very nice time to be a young scholar, because you could more easily get NIH money to work on your ideas. But at the same time, there was, as I said earlier, there was this push toward more centralization that was starting to come in within the NIH, and the doubling, I think, has had both good and bad consequences as a result. I mean, I think the hubris that we've seen by people like Collins, people like Fauci, are as a consequence of this sort of higher higher up the hierarchy in the mind of the public about where science belongs.
So Collins, to be clear, I don't know this history, but he has this tremendous discovery, and he rides that wave to become head of the NIH. Is that what happened?
Basically, yeah.
Okay. So we have this huge flow of new dollars into the system, leading all the way up to 2019, 2020. and it has to be like a boom in the scientific research community. So naturally, this community, scientific researchers, feel pretty darn secure, and maybe completely separated from the anxieties of most moms and dads when they're trying to figure out whether or not they're going to pay the rent and feed each other. Is the scientific community generally part of the laptop class?
Yeah, it is. The scientific community is protected from economic downturns. Their jobs often, in many times, can be replaced with work from home, and they were. I think that partly fed into why at least the most prominent members of the scientific community seem to be so favored of lockdowns. Actually, I want to make a distinction between the scientists and doctors and the healthcare system. Healthcare system, people who work in medicine actually are not part of the laptop class. Right? They actually were deemed essential workers, so that they had to come in and get exposed. In many times, they, especially in the early days of the pandemic, they thought of themselves as, and were, doing something heroic. They were exposing themselves to a deadly virus to care for people who were sick.
Yeah.
They also, many of them, especially the most prominent members of that class, pushed for lockdowns. And it's interesting because I think if you think about medicine as a vocation, it's a vocation where you're supposed to devote your life to the well-being of the patients that you're caring for. The structure of this vocation then is one of service. I am devoting my life to the people that I'm caring for, right? And so it's in that direction the service runs. The lockdowns actually reversed that and said, look, you, the population, should suffer so that my job as in medicine could be easier.
Yeah.
Right. It's a reversal of the norms of medicine, where medicine serves people, not people serve medicine. And in a sense, the fact that medicine were so strong, especially the leaders in medicine, were so strongly in favor of the lockdowns, is a violation of the ethics of the medical profession. It essentially transforms the doctor-patient relationship to one where the patient serves the doctor rather than the other way around.
And that ethos, this us versus them, were more important than the public, was kind of a cancerous attitude that I think has created so much of the societal unwinding and tribalism. But I watched way too many zombie movies, and it's always like the experts that have access to these elite facilities where they lock themselves down and they watch the world go to hell. That actually happened in this case, and that's a new thing too, right? They had the resources and they had the sort of authority to do this stuff to us. We can't let this happen again, which is why we're having this conversation. I can't believe that we have to have this conversation. I would have thought quite obviously that the human damage, the mental damage, the damage to the economy, even something like 9.1% inflation, this is a predictable direct result of the government response, where we locked people down and then we had to start giving them checks. Not enough to live, by the way, but a lot of that money went into the system itself. How do we convince people that this was a humanitarian disaster?
I do think we have to keep talking about this. I think if you just say, okay, well, this is something that happened 2 years ago, let's forget it and move on, this will happen again, right? The idea that lockdowns are a way to address any social problem, much less a health crisis like COVID, we need to actively and for substantive reasons reject it. And that means we need to have an honest discussion about what went wrong and why, and then commit to never doing it again, right? So I think the way that I'm thinking about this, I think that there's a lot of people in the community, people who have now formed against the lockdowns, that want to criminalize this. They want to say, okay, well, let's put people who made these decisions in jail. I actually don't think that's right. I think the right way to think about this is in medicine, when a patient dies, there sometimes will be something called a morbidity and mortality conference, an M&M conference, among all of the physicians that were managing the patient, and that it's just a meeting afterwards to talk about what went wrong. And the ethos of that meeting is not to point fingers and say you did this wrong, but just to say, look, this went wrong. Let's not do this again. And so that it's an opportunity for learning.
Yeah,
I think that's how we should do this as COVID evaluation. And I think there are countries that are starting to do this. Denmark is starting to do this. The UK is organizing a commission that's going to issue a report about the COVID response. The U.S. has had a very dishonest evaluation by the U.S. House, the Democratic-led House. It satisfies basically no one other than partisans, where they pointed the finger at someone like Scott Atlas for pushing against lockdowns, as if somehow he's the heel of the show.
Yeah.
So I think that has to happen, an honest evaluation. And I think, before that can happen, we have to be out of this fear, the power of the fear mongers to induce changes in policy has to subside before you can actually have that. But I do think that's going to come. I don't see how you can avoid it, Matt.
Yeah.
The damage is too great and the failure too evident.
I mean, I hear, and by the way, it's particularly noble of you to suggest that people shouldn't be held criminally accountable because the smear against you and your colleagues had real damage to your reputation and perhaps your careers. But my concern is, like, obviously, and we haven't even talked about the partisanship and the politicization of this whole process, but having some sort of objective assessment of what went wrong, that inevitably that accounting might be conducted by the same people that made the mistakes. And we've seen this with, there was some sort of phony research into whether or not there was a Wuhan leak and whether or not there was gain of function by the same people that would have been culpable had they found that there was a mistake. So how do you keep politics from continuing to define success and failure in this? Because that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years, but much further.
I don't have an answer. I've never worked in politics before, man. Maybe you have an answer to that question. I think for my part, what I can do is, and I'm working on is set the intellectual agenda for that evaluation when it happens.
Yeah.
Like, what are the questions to ask, right? I do think that the origins of the virus and the role of the NIH in funding gain of function work, all of that will be part of that investigation. Absolutely has to be. By the way, that was so dishonest. The same kind of playbook that people used to smear the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration were used to smear people who suggested that this might have been a lab leak.
Yeah.
Same people too, Francis Collins, Tony Fauci, doing the smearing. But the bigger thing to me, where I have particular expertise, is on the public health response and the failure of the public health response. And there we have to ask the right questions about what damage actually happened, why evidence-based standards for decision making were not adopted. Did public health use behavioral economics and psychological techniques to panic the population? Why didn't the standard pandemic of public health principle of reducing fear, reducing panic, why were those kinds of ideas thrown away? What role did local public health play? What autonomy do they have? How about I think there's a lot of really important questions that have to be addressed honestly, and won't be addressed unless you know how to ask them correctly.
So I want to go back to the incentive and knowledge problems, because when I saw Fauci and Collins' response to the Great Barrington Declaration, and when I heard them so full-throatedly choose winners and losers in the vaccine game, they had a horse in the race. Not knowing anything, I've learned a lot since then. Not really understanding at the time how the the market for innovation and discovery works. It's totally intertwined. Like the line between government and pharma companies is more blurred than I even imagined. It struck me that there was a CYA factor. Not knowing what happened in Wuhan, their reaction suggested to me, wow, they're covering something up. And then when they were so clearly advocating for vaccine X and sort of talking vaccine Y, it feels like they had a financial incentive to do so. And I've since discovered that there is, in fact, the government has a stake in Moderna and perhaps Pfizer. I don't know exactly, but it seems like truth and public health had nothing to do with this. Is that too strong? Am I making you squirm a little bit?
A little bit. I don't think they had nothing to do. I mean, I think there's mixed motives as in with all human activity. I think the vaccine. You're absolutely right that the origin of the virus, there was a cover up, no question. If you look at the FOIA emails from Fauci and Collins in the early days of the pandemic in January, February, there is no question, and it is, you can't read them and not come away with the conclusion that they worked very hard to make sure that nobody would think that the virus came out of a lab or that it was leaked from a lab, right? They wanted to make sure they wanted to turn that idea into a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And they used their
we
power.
weren't even allowed to talk about that a year ago. This show would have gotten taken down from YouTube. Hopefully it doesn't, but we'll see.
Well, I'm trying, Matt, to see this. But yeah, I think
what you're saying is that if we get taken down, it's going to be my fault, not yours.
That's just probably mine. But yeah, so I think there's no question that they conspiracized that. The development of the vaccine is a really interesting story, right? So the idea that you could develop a vaccine so quickly, that's something I got wrong in the early. Because normally vaccine development takes a very long time. It wouldn't be something you would expect to be able to both identify the right target for the vaccines in the sequence of the virus, and also test it and then deploy it at scale within 8-9 months. That was unimaginable to me in March of 2020. I'm still stunned that actually happened, right? And that happened in part because of a public-private partnership. It happened in part because of President Trump said we're gonna throw enormous resources into this Operation Warp Speed. We'll buy doses of the vaccine even before they're tested, so we can deploy them at scale if it just so happens that it turns out to work, right? That private-public partnership definitely involved so the NIH within the workings of the teams that developed that tested the vaccines in Pfizer and Moderna. The NIH, there's this act called the Bi-Dole Act, which allows the researchers at the NIH that work on some of the basic science advances and other work to share in the royalties. And I don't know how much of a role that played in their thinking. I have to say, my sense about someone like Francis Collins or Tony Fauci is that they're not motivated by money. They're more motivated by their reputation. But that doesn't mean that we can just ignore the fact that there were these incentives in place. They absolutely played an enormously important role in what the policies that were adopted but by the NIH and elsewhere in vaccine development and in vaccine deployment. And also in terms, so questions, for instance, is why the push for the mRNA platforms rather than the adenovirus vaccine platforms like the J&J or the AstraZeneca vaccine. I mean, many other countries went the other way. Right? Why did the United States go this direction? Well, the NIH invested a tremendous amount of money in these mRNA platforms. Why did they do that? Why not put your eggs in multiple baskets, right? More rather than just this one. There's also this legitimate question about what is the right role of the public when you're doing this kind of scientific work, right? I think to me that's like basic economics. There's this idea of externalities. You well know, Matt, I don't have to teach you, but the idea is that if you have a scientific idea, that is not excludable, right? So the structure of DNA, everyone benefits. There's going to be underinvestment by private actors in trying to develop that idea because you can't own it. So I think that there's a role for the NIH in investing in ideas that have that have this sort of positive externality, that have this this aspect where they're not ownable. But at the same time, they shouldn't be picking winners in the private sector. And the fact that the private sector uses these ideas, I think, is fine. I mean, in fact, it's a good thing. I mean, the whole purpose of science is so that everyone can use these ideas. But what's happened is the American government has become essentially vaccine salesmen, and not just any vaccine, just particular vaccines that the American government played an enormously important role in helping develop.
Yeah, and that to me seems like a pretty fundamental problem. I understand that we could imagine a world where public-private partnerships would sort of turbocharge the process of innovation. And by the way, I happen to be someone that has been highly critical of the FDA approval process and that it takes years and years and millions of dollars. And I'm an advocate of right to try. The problem becomes on the supply side when the government says you must take this one, and on the demand side that you must take this one, otherwise you can't have your government job, or you can't fly in a plane, or whatever these very aggressive incentives they created, which in all practical purpose was a vaccine mandate. I want patients free to choose, and I want choices on the production side, so that again this decentralized market process and local knowledge and various risk preferences and all the things that make us different as people, that to me would have been a more robust and safer way to respond to a pandemic. And you can imagine this scenario in government, but this is not how government works. Government is big and dumb, and it fails specifically when you need it not to. And you probably disagree with me, but I would advocate a clear separation of science and state, because I think the incentives are screwed up.
So I think actually there's two issues there. I want to make sure I address both of them. Let me come back to the vaccine mandates, because I think that's an incredibly important part of the conversation. I think they were an enormous mistake. But let me talk about the science and society, because that's a really interesting idea, Matt. I guess I don't fully agree a complete separation. What I do think is, and this is something I didn't really realize until the pandemic, is that science funders should have absolutely no role in health policy. There should be a bright ethical line dividing science funders and health policy, because what happens is that the science funders, as we talked about earlier, have a tremendous power over the minds of countless scientists, which then leads to, given the way our society works, huge policies adopted on the basis of essentially force, with very little opportunity for pushback. So someone like Tony Fauci can stay at the NIAID and help figure out which scientists ought to get funded, which scientists shouldn't, which ideas got to get funded, which ideas shouldn't. But he should not be advising presidents over health policy, over pandemic policy at all, ever. That should be seen as a just as bad as like having pharma advise the FDA about which drugs to approve and which not to approve. Right? The pharma shouldn't be like, the FDA shouldn't be captured by pharma. Health policy shouldn't be captured by people like scientific funders like Tony Fauci or Bill Gates. Right? Those should be bright ethical lines of the same way. Now, I think I do. The reason I push back a bit, Matt, on this is I do think there are legitimate roles for government in scientific funding of ideas that can't be funded really by private actors, in part because there's positive externalities that are not capturable, right? So there may be a basic science idea that's not patentable, but is very, very important. I think the government, you could argue the government has a role in that, right? Because you're going to have market failure. You want those kinds of ideas to come out. But I do completely agree with you that it's if there aren't these guidelines, these sort of ethical guidelines about how those that work goes on, it could be more even counterproductive. Maybe you want to get rid of those ideas rather than have someone like Tony Fauci saying, "I am the science," altering policy.
Yeah.
So I think that's a complicated question. I understand the gist of your argument, if I ever got it right.
And I could very much see an open, transparent process where you almost want an adversarial relationship between the executive branch and the grant givers within the institutions and the private companies that might be recipients of that. One more example that we could just go on all day, but this, and I don't want to go down the intellectual property rabbit hole, but one of the striking things that happened with the full-throated advocacy of certain vaccines was an absolute trashing of alternative therapeutics that would not have been profitable to roll out. And I don't know if we're allowed to say the I word or what's the other word, but you know what I'm talking about. I think we are now. I don't know.
Well, that by the way, is another big scandal, right? So the NIH, if it has a role on therapeutics, which it does, it should be funding studies and trials of products that the private sector wouldn't fund. And so why is remdesivir, why was it approved so quickly? Well, it had a firm, Gilead, which had a very strong interest, was still under patent, had a very strong interest in running very quick studies on it, and then making sure that the FDA approves it very quickly. And that's exactly what they did, right? Mm-hmm. In the early days of the pandemic. I don't think it's a very good drug, but like for COVID, but it got approved very quickly. All the studies were done very quickly. The NIH, as a public actor, it should be running studies on things that private actors have no incentive to run. So it's a scandal we don't know for certain whether ivermectin works. It's a scandal that we don't know for certain whether something like fluvoxamine works, right? I think the NIH's role was to as vigorously pursue the testing of these repurposed off-patent drugs as much as it intervened in the vaccine testing or more, right? Because there's no reason to put all your eggs in the vaccine basket when you might have these promising drugs that other people elsewhere are finding might work in certain settings. We don't know exactly when, or exactly the right dosing, or maybe it doesn't work. Like I think hydroxychloroquine probably doesn't work. You have to, if you're an NIH a director like Collins or Fauci, what you should do is invest in a broad portfolio of products that the private sector doesn't have an incentive to check. Yeah. And they failed at that.
Yeah. And going back to the politicization of all this, monoclonal antibodies were celebrated until a Republican governor from Florida who might run for president against Joe Biden embraced that.
That story is unbelievable, right? So monoclonal antibodies are tested and developed and tested, and so by summer of last year, actually even earlier, there are good trials run on monoclonal antibodies. Now they're specific to the particular variants, right? So the monoclonal antibodies that worked on when President Trump took them in October of 2020 are not the same ones that are being used now with a different variant. But the NIH evaluates them and says, look, these are useful. 70% reduction in mortality, according to one mortality and hospitalization risk, according to one study that was published in the New England Journal last year, 2021. But we don't deploy them at scale. Instead, we're saying, look, the only way to manage this is vaccines. But there's a lot of people that aren't taking the vaccines that are at risk, and even people that have the vaccines, some of them are getting very sick. Why not use them, right? When there was the Delta wave that hit Florida in 2021, right around this time last year, the Florida government, Governor DeSantis, he actually called me and asked me about this. About this idea is he deployed them at scale. he put a program in place where, like, if you were sick, you could call, and then, it's with the monoclonal antibodies, you have to get an IV drip. You can't take a pill, right? So normally you'd have to go to the hospital for this. So he had people, strike teams, come to your house and give you the drip.
Wow.
If you're really sick, right? So that was a really, really good idea. Like, it's how you save lives when you're in the middle of a pandemic.
It's how you would want the government to actually behave.
Yes.
Yeah.
What happened was
this is why I don't recognize it.
I mean, like, so it struck me as like this is completely reasonable. So what the Biden administration, what they did is they cut the supply of monoclonal antibodies to Florida, citing something called what they called temporal equity, meaning, well, we think the states in December are going to need this. You're using up all our supplies now in August, September. So we're going to cut the supplies so Florida patients die so that someone in Massachusetts can survive later, or California can survive later. The weird thing, the ironic, I mean, maybe that's not the ironic word, but the tragic thing is that when those states got hit, it was with a different variant, and the monoclonal antibodies that would have been useful for the Delta wave were no longer useful then. Those supplies were cut for nothing. And why would you cut supplies? Why not boost manufacturing?
Yeah.
I mean, it just doesn't make it made no sense other than trying to punish a Florida government that they disagreed with politically. It made no sense. And why would you punish the people of Florida for this? The fact that their governor was adopting this policy, trying to save their life. Yeah. It's an undertold story, and I think really a tragic one.
It was personal for me because by the time my wife Terry got COVID, monoclonal antibodies, they had just, and they basically nationalized the supply, and we couldn't get access, and luckily her case turned out to be fairly mild, but you don't know, and that was the whole point of the therapeutic, was to mitigate against a serious case.
Part of the thing, I think the story is not just the political aspect of a Republican governor. I think part of the story is also that the Biden administration's strategy was so focused on the vaccines that they viewed monoclonal antibodies not as an adjunct to try to save lives for people who weren't vaccinated or were sick anyways despite the vaccines. They viewed monoclonal antibodies as a threat to the vaccination program that they rolled out.
Yeah.
Right. So if their idea was that, well, if you tell people that there is this treatment available, then they won't get the vaccine. And therefore, we shouldn't tell people about this treatment. We should make this treatment less available. I think that was just a cruel thing to do, because essentially what you're telling people who are going to get sick despite the vaccine, and many of whom didn't take the vaccine, that you should just go die.
Yeah.
Right? That was just an unconscionable thing for the Biden administration to do.
And I'll offer a more cynical view, as I've been doing this whole time. You wouldn't get the political credit if you put all your eggs in the vaccine basket, and this is my presidency, is saving us from COVID through this vaccine. If there were therapeutics on the table that might help or might even do a better job for a lot of patients, that's a more difficult talking point. But I'm cynical. You're not. I want to wrap up with this question that you kind of dodged earlier. Because we just spent an hour explaining the disincentives for good scientists to speak up, and yet by the time you guys wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, you must have known that you were going to take a lot of heat. Maybe not nearly as much as you did, but why do it? Why do it?
So it was October 2020. I had just been through 6 very rough months. I'd written this study, I think I mentioned earlier, about the antibodies in Santa Clara County, LA County. The response from my institution, Stanford University, was very negative. Like I had to go through some very tough times. The press reacted to this study in a very negative way. Like there were hit pieces on my wife, on my family. Before that, I was just a scientist publishing papers with an audience of if I got 100 people to read my paper, I'd be pretty happy. And now I've got millions of people reading my paper, and people very upset with me because we found that the disease wasn't as deadly as people originally thought. In July, August of 2020, I kind of had to make a decision about what I really was about. right? If I could have just gone silent, and there's every incentive pointed in that direction. Like I just, because like my university was telling me that I could go back to my old career, they'd be perfectly fine with me. I was getting, it was really clear that if I just stopped talking or signed on to the agenda, then I'd be fine. Everyone would be, I could go back to being a tenured professor at Stanford, which is a very happy life. I couldn't do it, Matt. I couldn't do it. I don't think that the lockdowns are the right thing. My job as a health policy person, as a health economist, as an epidemiologist, all pointed in the direction of this is just a great wrong. And if I stayed silent now, I don't know how I could look back with my career with any pride. I just couldn't. I couldn't. And when the opportunity came up to work on this Great Barrington Declaration, it's still the proudest moment of my life.
Yeah, and I think both you and Sunetra Gupta both were born in India. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So you saw like one of my beliefs as a laptop class is I can't conceive of what a world would be like where people live on less than $2 a day, but you both saw that.
Yeah. Well, my mom grew up in a Calcutta slum. It was called Calcutta then, Kolkata now. When we first came to the United States, my dad worked at a McDonald's because he couldn't find a job. He's an electrical engineer. Eventually got a job as a rocket scientist, turns out. We lived in public housing. I hadn't really thought about that much until the pandemic, but it's clearly colored my views. I mean, I know from my relatives what it's like to live in a poor country. I know from the stories my mom told what it's like to be really, really, really poor. I worked in India when I was a medical student in a rural hospital. I saw firsthand what that is like. It's almost unimaginable to people living in rich countries to understand how close to devastation people really live. And the lockdowns, when they hit, the first thought I had was to the harm it was going to do to poor people everywhere. You can see it. That's exactly what's happened. And to me, that's always been the reason I think why I loved economics. Is it's helped make clear how to get people out of that situation, right? That we don't want. I mean, poverty is a devastating thing, but unfortunately, a very large fraction of the world still lives in poverty. The lockdowns are a step backward on that. And to me, that was my very first things think about lockdowns. I had to say something.
So where do we find, you're obviously still fighting. Maybe you've doubled down on fighting. Where do we find you, Martin and Sunetra? You're all still speaking out, I believe.
Yeah, we are. So Martin and I and Scott Atlas have started a new institute called the Academy of Science and Freedom, working with Hillsdale College. So that you can find, we're sort of ramping up operations for that. The goal there is to restore science to where it belongs in society. Science, as you can probably tell from this sort of conversation, I know you share this idea, is a very, very important human endeavor. But it needs to be a human endeavor, something that's used for the cause of freedom, not something to enslave, which is essentially what the lockdowns ended up being. And that's our goal there is to restore science, decentralize science again, so that it doesn't have this sort of concentrated power. There's the Brownstone Institute, which was founded by Jeffrey Tucker. Martin Kulov has worked very closely with them, where you can find a lot of the published work, and there've been a lot of great people who've been thinking about what the lockdowns have meant and what the consequences are, publishing there. So those two places, and I'm going to keep talking about this. I don't really know how to stop talking about it. My family is sick and tired of me talking about this, but I think I kind of need to keep going.
Well, I like. I should have said this. I mean, I'm a stage 4 cancer survivor. I would not be alive today if it wasn't for scientific innovation. So when I'm criticizing the system, my biggest concern is the credibility that the pharmaceutical companies and science and medical innovation, all of this stuff has been trashed in this process because people don't trust it anymore. And I think we have to restore that credibility. I mean, I think you separate it from politics, but I'm all in on that. And I would love to, when you guys get more going, I'd love to have that conversation.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. It's been fantastic. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that show, make sure that you like and subscribe. Click the little bell so that you get notifications. And if you consume this via podcast, go wherever you want to go. We're everywhere. Kibbe on Liberty. The revolution starts now.